In this last video about adjustments, I'm going to show you some techniques to increase the contrast in images. We've already seen some examples in previous videos about contrast, but here I'm going to show you some new techniques. So first of all, the levels adjustment layer is one of the most commonly used options which we work with whenever we want to increase the contrast. So let me add a levels adjustment layer, and one of the easiest things to do is whenever you see gaps in the histogram on the left or the right side, then you just simply drag the black point and white point closer to the peaks within the histogram. That way you are not clipping any details from the image, you are just increasing the contrast. So whatever is supposed to be the darkest detail in the image will be very close to be black, and the brightest details in the image will be very close to pure white. So that's exactly what happens when you drag these two arrows closer to the peaks. And we can have a look at before and after. Just by doing this, we managed to improve the image greatly. So before it was a bit washed out, gray, now it looks much stronger. Of course, if you want to go further than that, you can by again just cutting into these colors. But remember, keep an eye on the image and don't clip too many details, because after a while it will just get completely burnt. So all the darkest details will become completely black. Remember, holding down the Alt key while you are dragging this, you can see how much harm you are doing to the image. So avoid seeing any of these colorized pixels. If you see a bit, that's not a big problem. Just try to avoid seeing too many of those details if you hold down the Alt key while you are moving these around. But this technique we are aware of and we've seen this before. Let me show you another way of increasing the contrast. I'm going to temporarily turn off my levels adjustment layer and select the background image. And by pressing Command or Control J, you can very quickly duplicate the currently selected layer, even if it's a background layer. So that way you have now a second version of the same layer. And all you have to do to use this type of contrast technique is to change the blend mode to soft light or overlay if you want to get an even stronger contrast effect. We got a similar effect to using levels, but it was much faster. So all we had to do is to duplicate the layer and set it to that blend mode. And if you like the way the overlay blend mode works, but you just want to tone it down a bit, because it's a separate layer, you just have to reduce its opacity. Also, don't forget, if you want to apply contrast only on the top part of the image and not the road, for example, or maybe not even these hills in the foreground, then you can use masking for that. And what I would do actually in this case, if I use both of these layers, the adjustment and also the duplicate layer, I would select both of them together and then group them. Go to Layer, Group Layers, or press Command or Control G. Once you have the group, add the mask on the group itself, and then using the gradient tool, click and drag to create a gradient effect. We've done this before, and I showed you already. The reason I'm showing it again, because what I haven't mentioned so far is that you can adjust the way your mask works as well. So by clicking twice on the mask, you can reduce its density, and with that, you can allow the adjustment to seep into even these parts which you masked out. So by reducing it, you can see the mask is turning gray, which means it will let the adjustment go on these parts as well, but the mask is still there, so it is still restricting the contrast effects to go onto the bottom part of the image. And of course, we can change this gradient in any direction, but what I wanted to achieve is to avoid darkening too much the foreground. I wanted to mainly access and affect the top part of the image with the mountains. So now if I turn this off, that was before, and this is after. So only a bit of contrast increase on the bottom part of the image, but much more contrast on the mountains. So never forget that you can use masking techniques together with adjustments, because these non-destructive techniques really get effective once you start combining them. Now let me switch to another image on which I am going to use the camera raw filter to increase contrast. which has several ways of increasing the contrast. So first of all, I am going to go to the filter menu and choose Convert for Smart Filters, which will make our filter non-destructive. Once I see that layer became a smart object, I can go back to Filter and then choose Camera Raw Filter. One of the effects in Camera Raw that I love is the dehaze option, and that acts as a contrast increase. So if you increase that, it will intensify the colors and adds contrast to the image. So you can see before if I press P and after using dehaze. But if that's still not enough, you can go into the Basic tab and also use Clarity, which is another brilliant way of adding more contrast to it. So once again, before and after. And on top of this, you also have the option Contrast, which can add even more contrast if you need. So there's multiple ways of increasing the contrast here within the Camera Raw filter. Of course, I wouldn't normally use all three together, but Clarity and Dehaze can still work nicely together. But again, this was more like a reminder what we talked about once we were looking at smart filters. But for adding contrast, there's another brilliant technique using the Sharpen tool. And for this technique, let me use this image where we have quite a good contrast already. But what if we want to emphasize certain details? This is actually a sharpening technique, but it works also to add contrast. So what you need is a separate layer, an empty new layer on top of your current layer. So remember, that's the new layer icon. Click on that, and then you can call this sharpening or contrast, whatever you want. I always like to name my layers just so I know what I'm doing on them. And then the tool is going to be under the blur tool. It's called Sharpen. It's like a triangle. So once you select that, this has a brush size, and that can be changed with the square brackets on the keyboard. It has strength, which you can change with the numbers on your keyboard, like pressing 5 will switch to 50%, and so on and so forth. It also has an option called Protect Detail and Sample All Layers. Now, I prefer to have both of these on. And if you use a pen tablet, you can even turn on the pressure sensitivity for the size of the brush, which is also useful to have on. But the most important one is to use the Sample All Layers and do it on a separate layer. That way, it's not going to be destructive. So you can always make changes to it, thanks to it being on a separate layer. But look at this. If I start drawing over her eyes, for example, it immediately adds contrast and sharpness to those details. Now, if I turn this layer off, we can see before and after. So this is a local addition of contrast on details we want to really emphasize. We can use it on her hair as well, maybe, and around the face to really make it stand out, something like that. So if we turn it off and turn it back on, you can see how it looks. We could use it in all other details as well, of course. And if you feel like you've overdid it, you can always reduce the opacity of the layer. So that's just another great technique, and it actually shows even from a distance. So if I turn it off and back on, you can see it makes a big difference even from further away. Of course, if you want to be a bit more subtle with this tool, just reduce the strength. That way you will need a bit more brush strokes to build up the effect, but it will give you a bit more subtle, gradual build-up. So although we started talking about adjustments, you see we ended up including a couple of different methods using the Sharpen tool, duplicating layer and using blend modes, and even using the Camera Raw filter. So whenever we talk about adjustments, it doesn't mean that we purely have to rely on the adjustment layers and adjustment options. For achieving certain effects, you can always use combination of techniques in Photoshop. And that is what always will lead you to better results. But now we covered everything I wanted to show you about adjustments. We can move on to our next big topic, retouching. And first, in the next video, we will talk about the healing brushes.